Afghanistan stands among the rare nations that have never been conquered or colonized, despite relentless attempts by some of history's mightiest empires: Alexander the Great, the Persians, the Mongols, the British Empire, and even the Soviet Union, all of whom failed to subdue this resilient land. Many strategists attribute Afghanistan's enduring resistance to its formidable terrain. The vast mountain ranges conceal hidden valleys, secretive footpaths, strategic overlooks, and extensive cave networks, perfectly suited to shelter entire armies and frustrate foreign invaders. Even today, modern military forces, equipped with advanced technologies and surveillance capabilities, struggle to navigate Afghanistan's challenging landscape. Soldiers tasked with rooting out insurgents find themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered and confounded by the terrain. Yet while patrolling remote mountain paths, flying surveillance drones overhead, and interviewing local villagers, some soldiers have stumbled upon unsettling accounts, encounters suggesting that the mountains hide far more than just insurgents. These servicemen speak of witnessing creatures long dismissed as myths or believed extinct, particularly giants concealed deep within the Afghan mountains. The C-17 touched down with a jolt that rattled my teeth. After 14 hours in the air, my ass was numb, and my mind was foggy from the military-grade sedatives they'd practically forced on us to ensure we'd sleep during the flight. Outside the small porthole window, Baghdad sprawled beneath a haze of dust and smoke. Not exactly the tourist brochure version of Iraq. "Welcome to the sandbox, ladies," barked Staff Sergeant Mills as the plane taxied to a stop. "Welcome to Camp Victory." Victory, the name felt like a bad joke even then, in late 2004. When optimism about the war was already circling the drain. I shouldered my rucksack and followed the shuffling line of soldiers down the ramp into the wall of heat. The air hit me like an open oven, dry and scorching even though the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sprawling military base. "Specialist Carter!" a voice called out. "Ryan Carter!" A lanky corporal with a clipboard waved me over. "You're on perimeter security detail. Report to Sergeant Dawson at 0600 tomorrow. Tonight, get settled in Zone C, Tent 14. I nodded, trying not to show my disappointment. Perimeter security, guard duty. Not exactly what I'd imagined when I'd enlisted after 9/11, dreaming of heroics and purpose. But that's the Army for you. Selling adventure and delivering monotony with a side of danger. Camp Victory was established in 2003 around Saddam Hussein's Al-Fal Palace complex. By late 2004, it housed over 14,000 personnel and served as the primary base for coalition forces. Despite its fortified perimeter, the camp was frequently targeted by insurgent mortar attacks, and personnel reported high stress levels due to the constant threat of violence. Less documented were the numerous reports of unexplained phenomena that began to emerge during this period. The tent was standard issue, olive drab canvas stretched over aluminum poles, housing 12 soldiers in double-stacked cots. I claimed an empty bottom bunk near the back, as far from the door as possible. The less foot traffic, the better. "You the new guy?" A stocky specialist with a buzz cut and dark circles under his eyes extended his hand. "Mike Reeves, been here 4 months. "Ryan Carter," I said, shaking his hand. "Just landed." "Word of advice," Reeves said, lowering his voice. "Perimeter duty's not bad during the day. At night, though..." He glanced around as if checking who might be listening. "Stay alert, and not just for insurgents." I laughed, but Reeves didn't join in. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged. "You'll see. Just don't go wandering off alone after dark." Before I could press him, A call for chow sent everyone shuffling out. I followed, chalking up Reeves's warning to the typical hazing of newbies. The mess tent buzzed with conversation, the air thick with the smell of institutional cooking and body odor. I sat with my tray of something approximating meatloaf, listening to soldiers swap stories about home, complain about officers, and speculate about when they'd finally get to leave this hellhole. Night fell quickly in the desert. By the time I left the mess tent, darkness had swallowed the camp, punctuated by harsh floodlights that created islands of sickly yellow illumination amid deep shadows. The generators hummed their constant mechanical lullaby, a sound I would soon learn to tune out like my own heartbeat. I walked back to my tent alone, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air had cooled, but still felt like breathing through a wool blanket. As I passed between two supply containers, something moved in my peripheral vision. I stopped, turned. Nothing but darkness between the containers. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on my neck stood up as I peered into the shadows, my hand instinctively moving to where my sidearm would be if I'd been issued one yet. "Hello?" My voice sounded smaller than I intended. The darkness offered no reply, but I swear it deepened, as if gathering itself. A chill ran through me despite the lingering heat. "Get it together, Carter," I muttered to myself. "First night jitters." I hurried back to my tent, trying to ignore the sensation of eyes boring into my back. Numerous soldiers stationed at Camp Victory between 2003 and 2008 reported unexplained sightings and experiences, particularly during night shifts. While military psychologists attributed most accounts to combat stress, sleep deprivation, and the disorienting effects of deployment. The consistency of certain details across unrelated testimonies has fueled speculation about phenomena beyond conventional explanation. Sleep didn't come easily that first night. The cot was uncomfortable, the tent stifling despite the industrial fans circulating the hot air. Around me, other soldiers snored, mumbled, or tossed restlessly. Outside, the base never truly slept. Vehicles rumbled past, radios crackled, and occasionally distant explosions reminded us why we were there. I must have dozed off eventually because I jerked awake at 0300, according to my watch. Something had pulled me from sleep. A sound, maybe, or just the soldier's instinct that develops in dangerous places. The tent was quiet except for the breathing of sleeping men and the steady whir of the fans. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it. A soft scraping outside the tent wall beside my cot, like fingernails dragging slowly across the canvas. I turned my head, staring at the tent wall just inches from my face. The scraping moved, tracing a line parallel to my body. My mouth went dry. I wanted to call out, to wake someone, but pride kept me silent. What would I say? I'm scared of noises in the dark? The scraping stopped directly behind where my head rested. In the dim light filtering through the tent, I could see a slight depression in the canvas, as if something was pressing against it from outside. I held my breath, heart hammering. The depression deepened, forming the outline of what looked like a hand. Then it was gone. I lay frozen, straining to hear any sound of movement outside. Nothing. After what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, I convinced myself it was just a fellow soldier stumbling back from latrine duty, using the tent for support. When I finally drifted back to sleep near dawn, I dreamed of shadows moving independently of their owners and eyes watching from the darkness. Red eyes that seemed to float in the blackness between the tents and buildings of Camp Victory. The morning after my arrival, I reported for perimeter duty with eyes gritty from lack of sleep. The rising sun had already turned the sky a pale, washed-out blue, promising another day of merciless heat. "Carter, you'll be on the northwest corner today," Sergeant Dawson said, a weathered man with skin like tanned leather. Shadow Jenkins for your first week. Learn the routine." Jenkins was a lanky corporal with a permanent 1,000-yard stare. As we walked to our post, I debated whether to mention the strange scraping sound from the night before. "Sleep okay?" Jenkins asked, seemingly reading my thoughts. "Not really," I admitted. "Thought I heard something outside the tent. Probably nothing." Jenkins's stride faltered for just a moment. "What kind of something?" "Like fingernails on the canvas. Weird pressure, like someone pushing on the wall." He nodded slowly. "Happens. Wind picks up at night sometimes. Stray dogs, too." But his eyes told a different story. Specialist Michael Jenkins was interviewed in 2015 for this documentary. While he confirmed discussing strange occurrences with Specialist Carter, he initially refused to elaborate on his own experiences. After several hours of conversation with recording equipment turned off at his request, Jenkins described what he called the thing that watches us watch the perimeter. The following day, he contacted our production team to cancel all further participation. The northwest perimeter was a stretch of concrete barriers and razor wire facing an expanse of scrubby desert. Our guard tower was little more than a plywood box on stilts, baking in the sun. From this vantage point, Camp Victory sprawled behind us, a bizarre juxtaposition of military utility and Saddam's gaudy palace architecture. "Not much happens during the day," Jenkins explained, scanning the horizon through binoculars. "Night shifts when it gets interesting." "Insurgents? Sometimes." He lowered the binoculars. "Sometimes other things." Before I could ask what he meant, our radio crackled with a routine check-in. The rest of the day passed in mind-numbing monotony, the hours marked only by the sun's crawl across the sky and the sweat soaking through my uniform. That night in the mess tent, I found Reeves and slid onto the bench across from him. "How was first day of perimeter duty?" he asked around a mouthful of what the Army optimistically called chicken. "Boring as hell." Jenkins kept talking about night shift getting interesting, but wouldn't explain. Reeves exchanged glances with the soldier beside him. "You got night rotation yet?" "Tomorrow, 2200 to 0600. "Good luck with that." Reeves pushed his tray away. "Jenkins, see anything unusual today?" "No, why would he?" "No reason." Reeves stood abruptly. "Get some sleep before your shift tomorrow. You'll need it." Camp Victory's perimeter guards filed an unusually high number of incident reports involving unidentified figures approaching the base boundaries. Military records show that between 2003 to 2007, over 80% of these sightings occurred between 0100 and 0400 hours. In 67% of cases, guards reported the figures disappeared when illuminated or approached. Official investigations attributed these incidents to civilian movement, desert wildlife, or environmental misperception due to low light conditions and extended vigilance. My second night at Camp Victory, I slept fitfully, dreading my upcoming night shift. The scraping sound didn't return, but twice I jerked awake, certain someone had whispered my name. Each time I found only sleeping soldiers and the endless drone of generators. I reported for night duty at 21:45, adrenaline making me jumpy despite my fatigue. Jenkins was already in the tower, his face ghostly in the glow of the spotlight he was adjusting. "Ready for the exciting part of guard duty?" he asked without humor. "What exactly am I watching for out there?" I settled into the chair beside him, checking my rifle out of habit. "Official answer? Insurgents, vehicle approaches, anything suspicious." Jenkins handed me a thermos of coffee. "Unofficial answer? Everything." The first hours passed slowly. We took turns scanning the perimeter with night vision equipment, reporting the occasional wild dog or debris blown by the wind. Around 0130, Jenkins stepped outside to smoke. I was alone in the tower, fighting heavy eyelids, when movement caught my attention. A shadow darker than the surrounding darkness, about 200 meters out. I raised the night vision goggles. Nothing. Lowering them, I saw it again. A human-shaped silhouette standing motionless in the open desert. "Jenkins," I called, keeping my voice low. "Got something." No response. The figure remained still, barely perceptible against the night. I raised the spotlight remote, hesitated, then flicked it on. The powerful beam cut through the darkness, illuminating empty sand where the figure had stood. I swept the light in a wide arc. Nothing. "See something?" Jenkins was suddenly behind me, making me jump. There was someone out there, human-shaped, just standing, disappeared when I hit the lights. Jenkins took a long drag of his cigarette, the ember glowing bright orange in the darkness. "Describe it." "Just a shadow, standing there, watching us." "Eyes?" His voice had a strange intensity. "Did you see its eyes?" "No, it was too far." The radio interrupted with a routine check-in. After responding, Jenkins seemed to lose interest in my sighting, dismissing it as probably a Bedouin or a bush playing tricks. But I noticed he stayed inside the tower for the rest of our shift, chain-smoking and watching the darkness with unusual focus. At EU-345, I was scanning the perimeter again when I saw it. Closer now, perhaps 100 meters out. This time there was no mistaking the human outline. It stood perfectly still, facing our tower. "Jenkins," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the figure. 3 o'clock, 100 meters. He moved beside me, squinting into the darkness. "I don't—" "Right there," I pointed. Standing straight, looking right at us. As if responding to my words, the figure shifted slightly. And then I saw them. 2 points of light where eyes should be, glowing a dull red like dying embers. "Jesus Christ," I breathed. "You see it now?" Jenkins asked, his voice tight. "Its eyes. They're red." The spotlight remote was in my hand. I hit the button. Light flooded the desert, but the figure was gone. Not running away, not ducking down, simply gone, as if it had never been there. What the fuck was that? I turned to Jenkins, who was lighting another cigarette with shaking hands. "That," he said, exhaling smoke, "is what makes night shift interesting." The most consistent detail in accounts of the Camp Victory phenomenon was the description of glowing red eyes. While many witnesses later recanted their stories after returning stateside, psychological evaluations conducted in 2008 found no evidence of mass hallucination or suggestive contamination of testimony. The consistency of independent reports from personnel who had no prior contact remains unexplained. "You saw it, didn't you?" Reeves cornered me after breakfast the next morning. "The thing with the red eyes." I hesitated, then nodded. "Welcome to Camp Victory," he said grimly. "It knows you now. After my first night shift, sleep became my enemy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red points of light staring back at me from the darkness. I'd jolt awake, heart racing, certain something was watching me through the canvas walls of our tent. 3 days passed. I worked day shifts, ate tasteless meals, and wrote deliberately vague letters home. I told my parents about the heat, the dust, the tedium, not about red eyes watching from the desert or the growing sense that something was very wrong at Camp Victory. On my 4th night, I woke suddenly at EO 200, the familiar weight of being watched pressing down on me. The tent was quiet except for the soft sounds of sleeping soldiers. Something had pulled me from sleep, a sound barely perceptible beneath the drone of generators. I held my breath, listening. "Ryan?" My name, whispered so softly it might have been the wind. Except there was no wind tonight, just the stifling stillness of desert air. Ryan Carter. It came from outside, near the tent wall by my head, exactly where I'd seen that hand-shaped depression my first night. My throat closed up with fear, but I forced myself to turn toward the sound. The canvas wall bulged inward slightly, as if someone, something, was pressing against it from outside. "Who's there?" I whispered. The depression vanished. Silence returned, heavier than before. I lay awake until dawn, rifle clutched to my chest. Many soldiers at Camp Victory reported auditory phenomena accompanying visual sightings. These experiences ranged from unintelligible whispers to hearing their names called by voices they couldn't identify. Military psychologists classified these reports as hypnagogic hallucinations consistent with sleep disruption and combat stress. However, audio analysis of 3 unauthorized recordings made by personnel in 2005 revealed subvocal frequencies that couldn't be attributed to known environmental factors. "You look like shit, Carter," Jenkins remarked as we patrolled the perimeter the following day. "Thanks, not sleeping well." He nodded knowingly. "It's getting to you, isn't it?" I didn't need to ask what it was. "Heard my name last night, whispering right outside the tent." Jenkins stopped walking. "It spoke to you?" Something in his tone made my skin crawl. "You've heard it too?" "Not me." He shook his head. "But Alvarez did before you got here. Started with whispers, then got worse." "Where's Alvarez now?" "Transferred, medical discharge, psych issues." Jenkins resumed walking. "You should talk to Faisal. He works in the mess. Iraqi local, been here since we took the place." "Why Faisal?" "Because he's the only one who wasn't surprised when we started seeing things." That afternoon, I found Faisal cleaning tables after lunch. He was an older man with gray-streaked hair and the permanent stoop of someone used to making himself smaller in the presence of armed foreigners. "Excuse me," I approached carefully. "You're Faisal, right? Jenkins said I should talk to you." He glanced up, then around the empty mess tent. "About the red eyes, yes?" My heart skipped. "You know about that?" "Many soldiers ask me." He gestured for me to sit. "They see, they hear. They come to Faisal because I am from this place." "What is it?" I asked, leaning forward. "What are we seeing out there?" Faisal wiped his hands on his apron. "You Americans build your camp here without asking what was here before. This place has history, old history." "Like what?" "The old ones called them jinn, desert spirits, some good, some—" He shrugged. "Not good." "You're saying we're seeing ghosts?" "Not ghosts." Faisal shook his head emphatically. "Jinn are not dead people. They are different people. They live alongside us, usually separate. But sometimes, when humans bring violence and death to a place, the barrier becomes thin." I thought of those red eyes staring from the darkness. "And they can speak? Say your name?" Faisal's expression grew serious. "If it knows your name, you must be careful. Names have power. The red-eyed one, it watches longest before it speaks. It learns." "Learns what?" "What you fear." He returned to wiping tables. "What makes you weak?" While military personnel were discouraged from fraternizing extensively with local contractors, records show significant informal information exchange occurred. Anthropological studies conducted in the region document widespread belief in jinn spirits among the local population. These beliefs predate Islam and persist throughout the Middle East, with particular significance in areas with ancient Mesopotamian settlements. That night, I lay awake long after lights out. Faisal's words echoing in my mind. Outside, the wind had picked up, sending dust devils spinning between the tents. The canvas walls shuddered and snapped, perfect cover for something moving in the darkness. I must have drifted off despite my anxiety because suddenly I was awake again, alert to a change in the tent's atmosphere. The wind had died. The generators seemed distant. The air felt charged like before a lightning strike. "Ryan!" The whisper came from directly outside the tent wall, inches from my ear. I froze, not even breathing. "Ryan Carter, I see you." The voice was dry, like sand sliding over stone. Not quite male, not quite female. It had no accent I could place, yet something about it felt ancient and foreign. "What do you want?" I breathed, barely audible. Silence. Then, "What all watchers want, Ryan Carter, to see what happens next." The canvas depressed beside my head, forming what looked like a face, hollow eye sockets, the suggestion of a nose, a mouth open in a silent scream. I scrambled backward off my cot, crashing to the floor. Around me, soldiers stirred and cursed. "Carter! What the fuck?" Reeves hissed from the darkness. I pointed wordlessly at the tent wall, but the impression was already fading, like a handprint disappearing from fogged glass. "There's nothing there, man," Reeves said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Go back to sleep." I didn't. I sat on my cot until dawn, watching the tent wall, waiting for the whisper to return. It didn't. But as the first gray light filtered through the canvas, I noticed something on the ground beside my cot that hadn't been there before. A small, perfect circle of red desert sand. The circle of red sand haunted me. I couldn't explain its presence, perfectly formed, untouched by footprints, appearing silently while a dozen soldiers slept around me. I scooped it into an empty MRE packet, half expecting it to vanish or transform, but it remained ordinary desert sand, just redder than any I'd seen around camp. "You should throw that away," Reeves said, watching me from his bunk. "Why?" "Because it's not natural, man. It's—" He lowered his voice. "It's marking you." I wanted to dismiss his superstition, but after what I'd experienced, I couldn't. Still, I tucked the packet into my footlocker instead of discarding it. Evidence, I told myself, though of what I wasn't sure. That day's shift passed in a fog of fatigue and hypervigilance. Every shadow in my peripheral vision became the figure. Every whisper of wind carried my name. By afternoon, my hands trembled slightly as I scanned the perimeter. "Carter," Sergeant Dawson approached, eyeing me critically. "You with us today?" "Yes, Sergeant, just tired." "Tired doesn't cut it on perimeter watch. You see something out there, you need to be ready." He studied my face. "Heard you had an incident last night." News traveled fast. "Just a bad dream, Sergeant." "Right." He didn't believe me. "You're getting a new partner tonight. Specialist Townsend rotated out. Specialist Morales is down with some stomach bug. You'll be with Specialist Riggs." "Great." Another new face who'd think I was crazy if I mentioned red eyes watching from the darkness. "Jake Riggs," Dawson continued. "Good soldier. First deployment, like you. Maybe you two can keep each other alert instead of jumping at shadows." His tone made it clear this was both instruction and warning. The pairing of specialists Carter and Riggs was documented in duty rosters beginning October 11, 2004. Their assignment to the northwest perimeter coincided with a 40% increase in unidentified perimeter approach reports. While official records attribute this to heightened insurgent activity in the sector, personal journals and subsequent interviews suggest something else entirely was occurring on those long night watches. Jake Riggs was built like a linebacker, with close-cropped blonde hair and a permanent half-smile that suggested he found the world quietly amusing. He showed up 15 minutes early for our shift, extending a hand the size of a dinner plate. "Jake Riggs, heard you're the guy who keeps the northwest perimeter interesting." My stomach tightened. "What exactly did you hear?" "That you spotted something the other night. Something that disappeared when you lit it up." He shrugged. "Happens more than Command wants to admit." "You believe in that stuff?" I studied his face for mockery, but found none. 3 tours in Afghanistan before this. Saw things there I can't explain." Jake checked his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Figure Iraq's got its own mysteries." His matter-of-fact acceptance loosened something in my chest. As darkness fell and we settled into our watch, I found myself telling him everything. The red eyes, the whispers, the face pressed against my tent, the circle of sand. Jake listened without interruption, scanning the perimeter methodically as I spoke. "My grandmother was Cherokee," he said when I finished. "She used to talk about spirits that watch from the edges of firelight. Said they're drawn to places where life and death blur together." He gestured to the war-torn landscape around us. "Can't get much blurrier than this." Faisal called them jinn. Different names, same idea maybe. Jake raised his night vision goggles, scanning slowly. "The way I see it, either we're both crazy, or there's something out there. Either way, we watch each other's backs." The night deepened. We fell into a rhythm, alternating sweeps, checking blind spots, maintaining radio contact with other posts. Around 0200, that dead hour when the human mind is at its lowest ebb, Jake suddenly stiffened. 2 o'clock, maybe 150 meters, he whispered. I followed his gaze. At first I saw nothing but darkness. Then, movement. A figure, standing motionless where I was certain nothing had been moments before. "You see it?" Jake's voice was steady, but his knuckles whitened on his rifle. "I see it." My mouth went dry. "Wait for it." We watched in silence as the figure remained perfectly still. Then, slowly, 2 points of dull red light appeared where its eyes should be. "Holy shit!" Jake breathed. "That's what I saw before," I whispered. "Should I hit the spotlight?" "Not yet." Jake raised his night vision goggles. "I want to see what it does." Through the amplified greenish view, the figure should have been clearly visible, but Jake cursed softly. "It's not there. Not on the NVGs, but I can still see it with my naked eye." A chill ran through me. "That's not possible." "Tell that to our friend out there." As if hearing us, the figure took a step forward, then another. In all my previous sightings, it had remained distant, disappearing when illuminated. Now it was advancing. "Light it up," Jake said sharply. I hit the spotlight. Brilliant white light flooded the desert, revealing nothing but empty sand where the figure had stood. "Fuck!" I swept the light in an arc. "It's gone." "No," Jake said quietly. "Look again. 3 o'clock now. Closer." I shifted the beam. Nothing. But when I switched it off, I saw them immediately, the red eyes, now barely 100 meters out. The figure had moved while we were looking directly at it, somehow avoiding the light. "It's playing with us," I said. Jake nodded grimly. "And it's getting bolder." We radioed it in as an unidentified perimeter approach, but without confirmation on the night vision equipment, the watch commander dismissed it as environmental misperception. "They never believe it," Jake said after we signed off. "Not until they see it themselves." The rest of our shift passed in tense vigilance. The figure appeared twice more, each time closer, each time vanishing when illuminated only to reappear elsewhere. By dawn, my nerves were frayed to breaking point. As we walked back to the barracks, Jake stopped me with a hand on my shoulder. "Listen, Carter, whatever this thing is, it's escalating. First watching, then whispering, now approaching. We need to figure out what it wants. Faisal said it learns what we fear. Then maybe we need to learn about it too." Jake's expression was resolute. "Tonight after mess, we talk to Faisal together. Get everything he knows." I nodded, grateful not to be facing this alone anymore. That night, exhausted but too wired to sleep, I lay on my cot staring at the tent ceiling. The circle of red sand remained in my footlocker, a tangible reminder that whatever was happening wasn't just in my head. As I finally drifted towards sleep, the whisper came again, closer than ever, as if lips were pressed directly against my ear. "Ryan Carter, Jake Riggs, I see you both now." I bolted upright, heart pounding. Around me, the tent was silent, except for the breathing of sleeping soldiers. No impressions on the canvas, no circles of sand, but I knew with terrible certainty that the game had changed. The Watcher had learned a new name, and somehow that felt like the beginning of something worse. The mess tent was nearly empty when Jake and I cornered Faisal. The evening rush had passed, leaving only a few soldiers lingering over coffee and the kitchen staff cleaning up. Faisal was wiping down serving counters, his movements efficient and practiced. "Faisal," I approached cautiously, "this is Jake. We need to talk to you. About the thing with red eyes." Faisal's hands stilled. He glanced around, then gestured toward a secluded corner table. "Not here, outside." We followed him behind the mess tent where supply crates created a small private area. The evening air had cooled to something almost comfortable, and the sunset painted the western sky in violent shades of orange and red. Faisal pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, offering them first to us before lighting one for himself. His hands trembled slightly. "You have seen it again," he said. Not a question. "It's getting closer," I confirmed. "And last night, it spoke both our names." Faisal inhaled sharply, cigarette forgotten between his fingers. "Both? It knows both of you now? Is that significant?" Jake asked. "Very." Faisal's voice dropped lower. "The Watcher rarely takes interest in more than one at a time. It follows, it learns, it finishes, then moves to another." The way he said "finishes" made my skin crawl. "Finishes what, exactly?" Faisal looked away toward the darkening desert beyond the perimeter. "I should not speak of these things. My grandfather warned that speaking gives them power." "We need to know what we're dealing with," Jake pressed. "It's getting more aggressive." Interviews with local contractors who worked at Camp Victory revealed a complex relationship with the supernatural phenomena reported by U.S. personnel. Many acknowledged awareness of the sightings but were reluctant to discuss them in detail, citing cultural taboos. Faisal al-Jabouri was one of the few who eventually provided extensive testimony, though he requested his real name be withheld from all records. Faisal crushed his cigarette under his heel, shoulders slumping in resignation. "This place," he gestured broadly, "was not always a palace. Before Saddam, before the British, before Ottoman Empire even, this was a place of judgment." "Judgment?" I echoed. "Where ancient ones decided fate of criminals, of enemies, many executions, many bodies buried in this sand." His eyes met mine. "Blood soaks deep in desert, never truly dries." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "You're saying we built our base on an ancient execution ground? Americans always build on old places without asking what sleeps beneath." Faisal's tone held no accusation, just tired acceptance. The red-eyed one, It is oldest of the jinn here, a watcher at the edge between living and dead. Why is it fixated on us? I asked. It is drawn to those who also watch boundaries, guards, sentries. Faisal lit another cigarette, and to those who carry death with them. Jake and I exchanged glances. We were both infantry. Both had seen combat in our short time in country. The red sand, I said suddenly. I found a circle of it by my bunk. Faisal went very still. When? 2 nights ago, after it whispered my name. He closed his eyes briefly. It has marked your sleeping place. This is... He searched for the word. Bad. Very bad. What does it mean? Jake demanded. It means the barrier between your world and its world is thinning. Faisal's voice was grim. First it watches, then it speaks, then it marks, then it crosses. A chill ran through me despite the lingering heat. Crosses? You mean it can physically... Faisal! A sharp voice interrupted us. We turned to see a senior mess officer glaring from the doorway. Break's over. Inside now. Faisal stubbed out his cigarette, looking apologetically at us. I must go. As he turned to leave, I caught his arm. Wait, how do we stop it? He hesitated, glancing nervously at the impatient officer. You cannot stop what has always been here, he whispered. But jinn respect boundaries. If it has not crossed yet, you can strengthen the barrier. How? Salt, iron, prayers, if you believe. But most important... He pulled away as the officer called again, more sharply. Do not invite it, do not challenge it, and whatever you do, do not follow if it retreats. With that cryptic warning, he hurried back inside, leaving Jake and me alone in the gathering darkness. Well, that was reassuring, Jake muttered. Ancient execution grounds and boundary-crossing desert spirits. You think he's just messing with us? I wanted to believe that. But the memory of those red eyes in the darkness, the whispered names, the inexplicable circle of sand, it all felt too real. I think, Jake said carefully, that we need to take precautions without freaking ourselves out. Salt's easy enough to get from the mess. Iron we've got plenty of. And the prayers? I hadn't been inside a church since my grandmother's funeral. Jake shrugged. Couldn't hurt. As we walked back toward our tents, the base transformed around us. Floodlights came on, harsh white islands in a sea of deepening shadows. The distant thump of helicopters mixed with the ever-present generator hum, normal sounds of a military base at night. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from those shadows, calculating, patient, learning. He never said what happens, I realized aloud, after it crosses. Jake's expression was grim in the artificial light. Some questions, man. I don't think we want answered. That night, I lined my sleeping area with salt pilfered from the mess hall and placed my kabar knife under my pillow, iron at least. Jake had done the same, adding a crude cross made from tent stakes beside his cot. Sleep came reluctantly, my mind replaying Faisal's warnings on loop. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of red sand rising like water, filling our tent until we all drowned silently in its grainy embrace. I woke suddenly, the dream still clinging to me like cobwebs. The tent was dark except for the faint glow of a battle lantern near the entrance. According to my watch, it was 0317. That dead hour again. Something had woken me. A sound? A presence? I lay perfectly still, listening. There, a soft scraping against the canvas, circling the tent's perimeter slowly. Not the wind. This was deliberate, methodical, like fingers trailing along the wall, searching. The sound completed a full circuit of the tent, then stopped directly behind my cot. I could feel pressure building in the air, like the moment before a thunderclap. "Ryan Carter," came the whisper, dry as autumn leaves. "I found your iron. I found your salt." My blood froze. The voice was inside the tent now. "The Watcher sees the Watchers," it continued, closer to my ear. "The boundary thins." I forced myself to turn, slowly, dreading what I might see. Nothing was there, yet the voice had been so close I should have felt breath on my neck. Across the tent, Jake sat upright on his cot, eyes wide and fixed on something at the tent's entrance. I followed his gaze. A silhouette stood outlined against the battle lantern's glow. Human-shaped but wrong somehow, proportions slightly distorted. As we watched, it turned slowly toward us. Two dull red points of light gleamed where eyes should be. Jake reached for his rifle. I opened my mouth to shout a warning to the others, but before either of us could act, the figure stepped backward and melted into the solid canvas wall as if it were mist. The entire tent erupted in chaos as emergency sirens began wailing across the base. Soldiers scrambled for weapons and gear, shouting questions no one could answer. "Incoming! Perimeter breach! Northwest sector!" someone yelled from outside. Jake and I exchanged a single horrified glance. The northwest perimeter, our post, the Watcher had crossed. The northwest perimeter breach turned out to be nothing, at least nothing the Army could document. No footprints, no fence cuts, no physical evidence at all. Just a motion sensor trip and a thermal signature that disappeared before anyone could verify it. The official report called it equipment malfunction. The northwest perimeter breach turned out to be nothing, at least nothing the Army could document. No footprints, no fence cuts, no physical evidence at all. Just a motion sensor trip and a thermal signature that disappeared before anyone could verify it. The official report called it equipment malfunction. Jake and I knew better. "It was testing us," Jake said the next morning, his voice low as we sat in the mess tent, both of us hollow-eyed from another sleepless night. "Testing the boundaries." I pushed my untouched eggs around my tray. "It was inside the tent, Jake. Inside. Then it just walked through the wall." "I know what I saw." He leaned closer. "And what I saw shouldn't be possible." The mess tent buzzed with normal morning activity. Soldiers complaining about the food, discussing missions, planning their day. Their normalcy felt surreal after what we'd experienced. How could everything seem so ordinary when something impossible was hunting us? "Specialist Carter, Specialist Riggs." We both flinched at Sergeant Dawson's voice. He stood behind us, his weathered face unreadable. "Sir?" we answered in unison. "You two filed the initial report on that perimeter alert last night?" "Yes, Sergeant," Jake replied. Dawson studied us, his eyes lingering on our exhausted faces. "Command wants to talk to you. 0900 at the TOC." After he left, I felt my stomach knot. They think we're making this up. "Let them," Jake said grimly. "We know what's real." Later that morning, we sat across from Major Ellis and Captain Winters in the Tactical Operations Center. The fluorescent lights seemed unnaturally bright after days of darkness and shadows. "So," Major Ellis began, reviewing our report, "you claim to have seen a figure approach the perimeter multiple times over several nights, yet this figure doesn't appear on night vision, disappears when illuminated, and leaves no tracks." "That's correct, sir," I said. "And last night, you believe you saw this same figure inside your barracks, after which it, walked through a wall." His tone made it clear how ridiculous he found this. "We understand how it sounds, sir," Jake interjected, "but we're reporting what we observed." Captain Winters leaned forward. "Are either of you taking any medications, having trouble sleeping, experiencing unusual stress?" "With all due respect, Captain," I said, "we're not hallucinating." "No one's suggesting that," she replied smoothly. "Combat environments create unique psychological pressures. It's perfectly normal to see the same thing simultaneously," Jake interrupted. "To both hear it speak our names?" Major Ellis closed our file with a snap. "You're both being reassigned to different perimeter sections. Specialist Carter to the east gate, Specialist Riggs to the south wall. Different shifts." My heart sank. They were separating us. "And I'm recommending you both speak with Dr. Levine at medical." The Major's tone softened slightly. "This isn't punishment, but I can't have soldiers on perimeter watch who are distracted." The separation of personnel reporting unexplained phenomena was standard procedure at Camp Victory, though never officially acknowledged as policy. Military records show similar patterns across multiple deployments, witnesses reassigned, separated, and often referred for psychological evaluation. What remains unexplained is why these phenomena continued regardless of personnel rotations, and why certain sectors, particularly the northwest perimeter, maintained consistently higher incident rates. That night, alone in my new East Gate post, I felt exposed. The spotlight swept across empty desert, revealing nothing unusual, yet the darkness between scans seemed to pulse with malevolent awareness. I kept my rifle close, though I doubted it would help against something that could walk through walls. My new partner, Specialist Green, was a career soldier with 3 deployments under his belt. He barely spoke except to handle radio checks, spending most of the shift reading a tattered paperback. "You're the one who's been seeing things, right?" he finally asked around midnight. "Word travels fast." Green shrugged. "Always does. For what it's worth, you're not the first." I looked at him sharply. "You've seen it too?" "Didn't say that." He turned a page. "Just said you're not the first to report it." And most of them either shut up about it or got transferred." He glanced up. "The ones who wouldn't let it go ended up with Section 8 discharges." The warning was clear. Keep quiet or be labeled unstable. I focused on the perimeter, scanning methodically. No red eyes appeared that night. But the feeling of being watched never subsided. When dawn finally broke, I trudged back to my tent, dreading sleep, yet desperate for it. Inside, the atmosphere was different, tense, quiet. Several cots were empty. "Where is everyone?" I asked Reeves. "Didn't you hear? 3 guys from 2nd Platoon got hit by an IED last night. Rodriguez didn't make it." Reality crashed back. While I'd been hunting shadows, real people were dying in real violence. I felt a stab of shame for my preoccupation with what might have been nothing more than stress hallucinations. I collapsed onto my cot, too exhausted to even remove my boots. As consciousness faded, I thought I heard sand shifting beneath my bunk. The dream came immediately. I stood at our northwest perimeter post, alone. The desert stretched before me, silver under moonlight. A figure approached, walking with unnatural smoothness, its feet not quite touching the ground. "Ryan Carter," it said in that dry, ancient voice. "Do you know what lies beneath the sand?" I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure drew closer. It looked almost human, but wrong, like someone had described a person to an artist who'd never actually seen one. Its proportions were subtly distorted, its movements too fluid. "Your friend tries to hide from me," it continued, "but I found him, as I found you." "Jake?" I managed to say. "What did you do to him?" The figure's face remained shadowed, but those red eyes gleamed brighter. "Nothing yet, but time grows short." the barrier thins. It reached out a hand, too long, fingers like twigs, and touched my chest. I felt nothing physically, but a cold emptiness spread from the point of contact. "When the blood moon rises," it whispered, "I will show you what watches from beneath." I jerked awake, gasping. The tent was empty now, afternoon light filtering through the canvas. I'd slept through the day. My chest burned where the figure had touched me in the dream, and when I yanked up my shirt, I found a perfect circle of red sand clinging to my skin. I brushed it away with shaking hands, but the outline remained. A faint red circle, like a target. Jake. I needed to find Jake. I located him coming off his shift at the south wall, his face haggard with exhaustion. "We need to talk," I said, pulling him aside. "They're watching us," he warned, nodding toward 2 MPs casually patrolling nearby. "I don't care. Something's happening. It's getting worse." I showed him the mark on my chest. His eyes widened. "I've got one too." He lifted his sleeve to reveal an identical circle on his forearm. "Woke up with it this morning. It came to me in a dream," I told him. "Said something about a blood moon and what watches from beneath." Jake looked up at the sky. "Blood moon's another name for a lunar eclipse. There's one tomorrow night." My blood ran cold. "It's planning something." "We need help," Jake decided. "Real help, not salt and knives." "Who?" "Command thinks we're crazy. The chaplain will tell us to pray." "Faisal," Jake said. "He knows what this thing is, and I think he knows more than he told us." As we headed toward the mess tent, the sun began to set, painting Camp Victory in crimson light. The color reminded me too much of those watching eyes, that circle of sand. I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. What we didn't know then was just how right we were. Finding Faisal proved harder than expected. He wasn't at his usual post in the mess tent, and the other Iraqi workers claimed not to know where he was, though their averted eyes suggested otherwise. "They're scared," Jake observed as we left the mess. "They know something's happening." The base felt different that evening, tenser, the air heavy with unspoken dread. Even soldiers who knew nothing about our red-eyed watcher seemed on edge, hands staying closer to weapons, voices lower than usual. "Blood moon tomorrow," a specialist remarked as we passed. "Bad luck to fight under a blood moon." His buddy laughed it off, but without conviction. Superstitions flourish in war zones. When death is a daily possibility, patterns and omens become lifelines of predictability. We finally tracked Faisal to the supply area behind the mess, where he was inventorying crates of rations. He flinched when he saw us, eyes darting to check if we'd been followed. "You should not be here," he hissed. "Not with me. Not now." "We need your help," I said, showing him the faint red circle on my chest. "It's marking us." Faisal's face drained of color. "Both of you? It has marked both?" Jake revealed his own mark. "What does it mean?" Faisal set down his clipboard, hands trembling. "It means the crossing is near. The blood moon opens the way." "The way for what?" I pressed. "For it to take physical form," he whispered, "to cross completely from its world to ours." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Until now, the entity had been limited, appearing at a distance, vanishing when approached, manifesting briefly inside our tent before dissolving through the wall. But if Faisal was right, tomorrow night those limitations would vanish. "How do we stop it?" Jake demanded. Faisal glanced nervously toward the mess tent. "Meet me at the water treatment plant at midnight. Not safe to talk here." He hurried away before we could question him further. Local contractor interviews revealed a complex web of beliefs surrounding the Camp Victory phenomena. While American personnel typically interpreted events through a Western paranormal lens, Iraqi workers contextualized the same experiences within their cultural framework of jinn mythology. This created parallel narratives, same observations, drastically different explanations, that rarely intersected in official reports. The water treatment plant sat at the northern edge of the base, a utilitarian concrete structure humming with machinery. At midnight, the area was deserted except for a single bored guard who knew Jake from previous rotations and was willing to look the other way for a pack of cigarettes. Faisal arrived minutes later, carrying a small canvas bag. His face was drawn with worry. "I risk much coming here," he said, "if others knew I was helping against the jinn." "We appreciate it," I assured him. "What can we do about these marks?" He opened his bag, removing a small glass bottle of clear liquid. "Rose water and salt, blessed by Imam." He handed it to me. "Wash the marks with this. It will not remove them, but may weaken their connection." Jake took the bottle skeptically. "And then what?" "Tomorrow night, you must be ready." Faisal removed several more items from his bag, a handful of small iron nails, a pouch of salt, and a tarnished metal disc etched with intricate patterns. "The Watcher will come for you both when the moon turns red. It will be strongest then, most solid, most dangerous." "Why us?" I asked the question that had been haunting me. "Why did it choose us specifically?" Faisal hesitated. "The jinn are drawn to those who resonate with them. Have you taken life in this war?" The question hit like a punch to the gut. 3 weeks into my deployment, our convoy had been ambushed. I'd fired at shadows, at muzzle flashes in doorways. Never knew if I'd hit anyone until later, when the body count came in. Jake's expression told a similar story. "The Watcher feeds on death," Faisal continued. "Not just ancient deaths in this soil, but fresh death that clings to soldiers' souls. You have both killed, you both stand guard. You are perfect vessels." "Vessels?" Jake's voice sharpened. "What exactly is this thing planning to do with us?" "It needs human form to fully enter this world," Faisal explained. "The blood moon allows it to try. If it succeeds..." He shook his head. "Bad things. Very bad." The vagueness was somehow more terrifying than specifics would have been. "So what's the plan?" I asked, trying to focus on practicalities rather than the horror of what Faisal was describing. "Tomorrow night, you must draw it out, then trap it." He handed Jake the metal disc. "This is a seal of Solomon, ancient protection against jinn. When the Watcher appears, you must get it to cross this seal." "And then what?" Jake asked. "Then I will speak the binding words." Faisal's expression was grim. "If Allah wills, it will be trapped between worlds again." "If Allah wills?" I didn't like the uncertainty in his phrasing. "This one is old," Faisal said softly. "Very old. It has been here since before Islam, before Christianity even. It knows many tricks." As we worked out the details of our plan, a chill wind picked up, sending dust devils swirling around our feet. The base lights seemed dimmer suddenly, the shadows deeper. "It knows," Faisal whispered, looking around nervously. "It listens even now." "Let it listen," Jake said defiantly. "Tomorrow night, this ends." We agreed to meet at the abandoned motorpool on the northwest edge of the base, close enough to our original perimeter post that the entity would be drawn there, but isolated enough that we wouldn't endanger others if things went wrong. As Faisal hurried away, I turned to Jake. "You really think this will work? You got a better idea?" He pocketed the seal. "Besides, what choice do we have? Wait for this thing to possess us during the eclipse? Back at my tent, I washed the red circle on my chest with Faisal's rosewater mixture. It stung like alcohol on a wound, the mark briefly flaring brighter before fading to a duller red. Not gone, but quieter somehow. Sleep came in fitful bursts, my dreams filled with red sand rising like floodwater, submerging the camp while soldiers drowned silently, their eyes turning to glowing embers as the sand filled their lungs. I woke at dawn, sheets damp with sweat, the dream clinging to me like a physical presence. Outside, the camp was stirring to life, oblivious to what would happen when night fell and the moon turned red. We had our assignments for the day, me at the east gate again, Jake at the south wall, but Sergeant Dawson pulled us both aside before we reported. "You two look like hell," he observed bluntly. "Whatever's going on, get it sorted. I need you combat effective." "Yes, Sergeant," we replied automatically. His eyes narrowed. "The Major's watching you both. One more incident report with unexplained sightings, and you're both heading to psych eval. Clear?" "Crystal, Sergeant." As we parted ways, Jake gripped my shoulder. "Tonight," he said simply, "be ready." I nodded, feeling the weight of the hours ahead. Tonight. What we didn't realize then was that the Watcher had its own plans for the blood moon rising, plans that had been in motion since long before we arrived at Camp Victory, before the war, before any of us were born. Plans written in blood and sand, waiting only for the right vessels to give them form. The day of the blood moon crawled by with excruciating slowness. Each minute on perimeter duty felt like an hour, my eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of our red-eyed Watcher. The desert stretched empty before me, deceptively peaceful under the harsh sunlight, but I knew what waited in the shadows. "Carter, you still with us?" Specialist Green's voice snapped me back to attention. "Yeah," I muttered, adjusting my grip on my rifle. "Just tired." Green studied me with narrowed eyes. "You're jumping at shadows again. Whatever's eating you, get it under control before tonight's shift." If only he knew. Tonight wouldn't be just another shift. Tonight, under the blood moon, Jake and I would confront whatever ancient thing had been stalking us, or it would take us as vessels. The thought made my marked chest burn beneath my body armor. When my shift finally ended, I found Jake waiting near the barracks, his face as haggard as I felt. "Did you sleep at all?" I asked. He shook his head. "Kept hearing whispers, like sand moving under my cot." "Same." I glanced at my watch. "We've got 4 hours until moonrise." Faisal said to meet him at 2100. "You still have his supplies?" I nodded, patting my pocket where I'd stashed the salt pouch and iron nails. Jake had the Solomon seal, the most important piece of our makeshift defense. As dusk approached, a strange quiet settled over Camp Victory. The usual background noise, generators, vehicles, soldiers calling to each other, seemed muffled, as if the base itself were holding its breath. The sky to the east darkened to deep indigo while the western horizon still burned orange. "Blood moon," a passing soldier remarked, pointing upward where the first stars were appearing. "Bad omen in these parts." He had no idea how right he was. The abandoned motorpool was a graveyard of damaged vehicles waiting for parts or disposal. Humvees with blown-out windows, trucks with shrapnel-riddled panels, and stripped-down chassis forming shadowy hulks in the gathering darkness. We arrived early, using red lens flashlights to set up Faisal's protective measures according to his instructions. "Salt circle here," I said, carefully pouring the white grains in a perfect ring around the metal Solomon seal Jake had placed on the ground. "Iron nails at the cardinal points." Jake checked his watch nervously. "Where's Faisal?" He should be here by now. He'll come, I assured him, though doubt gnawed at me. He knows what's at stake. As if summoned by our conversation, a figure appeared at the edge of the motorpool. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm before I recognized Faisal's slight frame. He hurried toward us, clutching his canvas bag. "It is not safe here," he whispered, eyes darting nervously around the shadowy vehicles. "The Watcher is already close. I feel it." "We're ready," Jake said, indicating our preparations. "Salt circle, iron nails, seal in place." Faisal nodded approvingly, then removed a small leather-bound book from his bag. "The binding words are here. When it crosses the seal, I must speak them without interruption." "And if that doesn't work?" I asked. Faisal's expression was grim. "Then Allah have mercy on us all." The eastern sky darkened completely as we took our positions. The moon rose, already beginning to dim, as Earth's shadow crept across its face. The air grew unnaturally still, the temperature dropping despite the day's lingering heat. "It's starting," Jake whispered, pointing to the moon. A reddish tinge was spreading across its surface. My marked chest began to burn, a dull pain radiating outward from the circle. Jake winced, clutching his forearm where his own mark throbbed. Faisal muttered prayers under his breath, fingers tight around his book. "There!" I hissed suddenly, pointing toward the perimeter fence. A figure stood motionless in the shadows, taller than I remembered, its proportions subtly wrong. As we watched, it took a step forward, moving with that unnatural fluidity I'd seen in my dreams. Two dull, red points of light gleamed where eyes should be. "It's more solid than before," Jake observed, his voice tight with tension. "I can see details now." He was right. Previously, the Watcher had been little more than a silhouette, a shadow darker than its surroundings. Now I could make out the suggestion of clothing, something like robes, ancient and tattered, and limbs that seemed too long, too jointed, like a spider's legs given human form. "Ryan Carter, Jake Riggs." The voice carried across the motorpool, dry as millennia of desert wind. "The Watchers become the watched." "We're ready for you," Jake called back, his defiance undermined by the slight tremor in his voice. "Are you?" The figure took another step closer, and I felt the air pressure change, my ears popping as if at high altitude. "Ready to see what lies beneath the sand? What has always been watching?" The blood moon reached totality overhead, bathing Camp Victory in an eerie crimson glow. As if responding to this celestial signal, the Watcher began to move toward us with purpose, no longer the cautious stalker, but a predator closing in for the kill. "It must cross the seal," Faisal reminded us urgently. "You must make it cross." Jake and I exchanged glances. We'd discussed this part of the plan, but neither of us had been eager to serve as bait. "Hey!" I shouted, stepping forward, but careful to stay behind the salt circle. "You've been following us, learning our names, marking us. Why don't you show us what you really are?" The figure paused, those red eyes brightening with what might have been amusement. "You invite me closer, Ryan Carter?" "I'm calling your bluff," I replied, heart hammering. "You're all whispers and shadows. If you're so powerful, why hide in the dark?" A sound emerged from the figure, not quite laughter, more like sand pouring over stone, an abrasive approximation of mirth. "Brave little soldier, playing games you don't understand." It moved closer, now just meters from our salt circle. I could see its face, or rather, the absence of one. Where features should have been, there was only darkness, deeper than the night around us, with those burning eyes floating in the void. "The barrier thins," it said, raising arms that seemed to elongate as they reached toward us. The vessels await. "Now!" Jake shouted, lunging forward to grab my shoulder, pulling me backward. The watcher surged forward, crossing the salt line with a sound like glass cracking. It stepped directly onto the Solomon seal and froze, its form suddenly rigid. "Faisal!" I yelled. "Now!" Faisal began reciting from his book, ancient Arabic phrases tumbling from his lips in a rhythmic chant. The air around the seal seemed to thicken, distort, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. The watcher writhed within this invisible containment, its form fluctuating between solid and insubstantial. Those red eyes flared brighter, fixing on me with terrible intensity. "This changes nothing," it hissed, voice somehow inside my head rather than in the air. "The boundary is already broken. What watches from beneath is already rising." The seal beneath its feet began to glow, etched patterns burning with white fire that contrasted sharply with the blood-red moonlight. The watcher's form stretched upward, elongating impossibly before collapsing in on itself like a dying star. A concussive wave of force knocked us backward as the entity imploded with a sound like the desert itself screaming. Where it had stood, only the glowing seal remained, its light gradually fading until the motorpool was once again dark except for the crimson moonlight. "Is it over?" Jake asked, helping me to my feet. "Did we do it?" Faisal closed his book, his face grave. "It is banished for now, but it spoke truth. The boundary is weakened. What watches from beneath?" He trailed off, looking toward the desert beyond the perimeter. "What?" I pressed. "What watches from beneath?" "Pray you never learn," Faisal whispered. "Pray we have done enough." As the blood moon began to brighten, Earth's shadow receding, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't ended anything tonight. We had only postponed the inevitable. 3 days passed after our confrontation with the Watcher. 3 days of silence, of normal perimeter watches and dreamless sleep. The red marks on our chests and arms faded to faint pink outlines, then disappeared altogether. Camp Victory returned to its regular rhythm of missions, maintenance, and mind-numbing routine. "Maybe it worked," Jake said as we shared a smoke behind the barracks. Command had stopped separating us after our hallucinations apparently ceased. Maybe Faisal's binding thing actually trapped it. I wanted to believe that. God, how I wanted to. But something felt unfinished, like the calm before a storm rather than true peace. "You notice Faisal's gone?" I asked instead of answering directly. Jake frowned. "What do you mean, gone?" "He hasn't been in the mess for 3 days. I asked the other workers and they just look away, won't talk about him." A troubled expression crossed Jake's face. "You think something happened to him?" I took a long drag of my cigarette, watching the smoke curl against the cloudless sky. I think whatever we did that night had consequences. The Solomon seal had vanished when we returned to the motorpool the next morning. Not even an impression left in the dust where it had been. The salt circle remained, though, perfect and undisturbed, as if nothing had crossed it in either direction. We should try to find him, Jake decided. Make sure he's okay. Finding information about local contractors proved nearly impossible. The chain of command directed us in circles, from admin to logistics to personnel and back again. No one seemed to have records of exactly which Iraqis worked where or who supervised them. "It's like he never existed," I said after our third failed attempt to locate Faisal. "Like someone erased him." That night, I took my usual position at the east gate, scanning the perimeter with practiced efficiency. The desert stretched empty and quiet, no red eyes watching from the darkness. Yet the silence itself felt oppressive, expectant. Near the end of my shift, as false dawn lightened the eastern horizon, I heard it, so faint I almost missed it beneath the generator's hum. "Ryan," I froze, rifle halfway through its sweep. The whisper had come from everywhere and nowhere, like sand shifting beneath my feet. "Ryan Carter, it isn't over." The voice wasn't the dry, ancient rasp of the Watcher. It was Faisal's voice, strained and distant, as if calling from very far away. "Faisal?" I whispered, scanning the darkness. "Where are you?" "Beneath." The word faded like a radio losing signal. "What watches from beneath?" I reported nothing. What could I say? That I'd heard the disembodied voice of a missing Iraqi contractor? I'd be in psych eval before the words left my mouth. Instead, I finished my shift in silence, the whisper echoing in my mind. Documentary producer's note. The following section is based on Specialist Carter's personal journal, recovered during research for this series. Its authenticity has been verified by handwriting analysis and correlation with known events at Camp Victory. Journal entry, November 14, 2004. Something's wrong with this place. Not just the Watcher, something deeper. I keep dreaming about red sand rising like water, filling my lungs, my eyes. In the dreams, I can see through the sand somehow, see what's buried beneath Camp Victory. Something vast, something ancient. The Watcher wasn't the threat. It was just the sentinel, the guardian. And we banished it. Jake feels it too. Says the ground sometimes vibrates beneath his cot at night. Not like mortar fire or vehicles, more like something shifting in its sleep. We haven't seen any red eyes since the blood moon, but the silence feels worse somehow. Like holding your breath underwater, knowing you'll eventually have to surface. Faisal is still missing. No one will talk about him. It's like he's been erased from the camp's memory. But I heard him last night, calling from somewhere I couldn't see, calling from beneath. I found a new circle of red sand this morning, not by my bunk, in the center of our tent, perfectly round, about a meter wide. No one else seems to notice it. When I walk through it, my boots leave no tracks. The sand refills my footprints like water. Something is coming. The dreams intensified over the next week. Each night, the red sand rose higher, revealing more of what lay beneath. Massive stone structures, older than civilization, buried beneath the desert. In the dreams, I could read the carvings on those stones, understand the symbols that crawled across their surfaces like living things. I began to understand what the Watcher had been guarding against, what it had kept contained for millennia, and what we had unleashed by banishing it. "We need to tell someone," Jake insisted after I showed him my journal. The pages now filled with sketches of the structures from my dreams and symbols I couldn't remember drawing. "This is bigger than us." "Tell who?" I countered. "Command? The chaplain? They'll think we're having shared delusions." "Then we go back to Faisal's people, the other Iraqi workers. Someone must know what's happening." It was a desperate plan, but the only one we had. That evening, we cornered an older Iraqi man who worked in the laundry facility, Nasir, one of the few locals who would still make eye contact with us. "We need to know about Faisal," Jake said without preamble, "and about what watches from beneath the sand." Nasir's weathered face went pale. He glanced around nervously before pulling us into the noisy laundry room where the industrial machines would cover our conversation. "You should not speak of such things," he hissed. "The Americans have disturbed what should remain buried, first with their bombs that shook the earth, then with their digging to build this camp." "What's buried here?" I pressed. "What did we unleash when we banished the Watcher?" Nasir's eyes widened. "You banished the red-eyed one?" His voice was barely audible over the laundry machines. "Fools, it was not your enemy. It was all that stood between this world and what lies beneath. "Which is what exactly?" Jake demanded. "The old ones called it different names. The Sleeper, the Buried God, the Sand Father." Nasir made a protective gesture. "It sleeps beneath the desert, dreaming of when it ruled this land. The red-eyed Watcher was its jailer, not its servant." My blood ran cold as the pieces fell into place. "And Faisal? Where is he?" "Gone to warn the others." Nasir's expression was grim. "Or taken by what rises. Either way, you will not see him again in this world." That night, the silence around Camp Victory deepened. The endless generator hum seemed muted. The normal sounds of a military base oddly dampened. Even the stars looked distant and cold, as if withdrawing from what was about to happen. I lay on my cot, afraid to close my eyes, afraid of the dreams that waited. Beside me, Jake tossed restlessly, occasionally muttering in his sleep. Just as exhaustion began to pull me under, I heard it again. Faisal's voice, closer now, more urgent. "Ryan, Jake, it comes. The sand rises." I sat up, fully alert. The tent was quiet except for the breathing of sleeping soldiers. Nothing seemed amiss, and yet the air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. The ground beneath my cot vibrated subtly, not the familiar rumble of distant explosions or passing vehicles, but something deeper, more rhythmic, like breathing. "Jake," I whispered, reaching across to shake him awake. "Do you feel that?" He was already sitting up, eyes wide in the darkness. "The ground. It's moving." As if responding to our awareness, the vibration intensified. Around us, other soldiers stirred, mumbling questions. Someone switched on a battle lantern, casting harsh shadows across confused faces. "Earthquake?" someone suggested. "Not in this region," another replied. The shaking grew stronger. Outside, we heard shouts as soldiers emerged from tents and barracks, radios crackling with confused reports. Jake and I exchanged a single horrified glance. We knew what was happening. "What watches from beneath?" I whispered. As if summoned by my words, a fine red mist began to seep through the tent floor, not falling from above, but rising from below, defying gravity. It swirled around our feet, curling up our legs like curious tendrils. "Everyone out!" Jake shouted. "Now!" We evacuated the tent just as the shaking reached its peak. Outside, chaos reigned. Soldiers stumbled around in confusion. Officers barked contradictory orders, and in the distance, warning sirens began to wail. But above it all, I heard one sound that froze my blood, a whisper that seemed to come from the sand itself, from the earth beneath our feet, from the air we breathed. "Ryan Carter, I see you now." It wasn't Faisal's voice anymore. It wasn't the Watcher's voice either. This was something older, vaster, a voice like continents shifting, like mountains grinding together. The voice of what had always been watching from beneath. As the red mist thickened around us, I grabbed Jake's arm. "We need to get out of here. The whole camp, everyone needs to evacuate." But it was already too late. The sand was rising, not just around us, but throughout Camp Victory. Seeping up through floors, swirling down from the night sky, forming patterns too perfect to be natural. Circles within circles, symbols like those I'd drawn without understanding. In the distance, where the desert met the perimeter fence, something vast was taking shape in the darkness. A silhouette blacker than the night sky, rising like a tide of shadow. And somewhere, lost in the chaos of evacuation orders and confusion, I heard Faisal's voice one last time. "The Watcher returns. The circle closes. Then silence fell across Camp Victory, a silence so complete it seemed to swallow all other sounds, all thought, all hope. The silence of sand-filling lungs, the silence of ancient eyes opening, the silence of what had always been watching. 15 years. That's how long it's been since I left Iraq, since I walked away from Camp Victory with nightmares that refuse to fade and questions that will never be answered. Some nights I still wake up gasping, my sheets damp with sweat, convinced I can feel red sand filling my lungs. I'm 39 now, hair thinning, a mortgage, a job selling insurance in Columbus, Ohio. On paper, I'm Specialist Ryan Carter no more, just Ryan, the guy with the quiet smile who sometimes stares too long at shadows. The guy who keeps a jar of salt beside his bed that his girlfriend thinks is some weird superstition. She's not entirely wrong. The official record shows I was medically evacuated from Iraq following what they termed a stress-induced dissociative episode. My file mentions hallucinations, paranoia, and PTSD. What it doesn't mention is Jake Riggs, or Faisal, or the fact that 17 other soldiers reported identical hallucinations that night. What it doesn't mention is the red sand. You understand why we're asking you to participate in this documentary, Mr. Carter? The producer sits across from me, her recorder placed carefully between us. Your account matches others we've collected. Something happened at Camp Victory that night that was never properly explained. I study her face, looking for mockery or disbelief. I find only curiosity. What happened to Jake? I ask instead of answering. It's the question I've carried for 15 years, the one the Army refused to address. She hesitates. Specialist Riggs was transferred to Germany for psychiatric evaluation shortly after the incident. He received a medical discharge in 2005. She pauses. We've been unable to locate him for this documentary. Of course they have. Jake disappeared himself after coming home. Smart man. And Faisal? No record of any contractor by that name ever working at Camp Victory. I laugh, but there's no humor in it. Of course not. The days following what the military officially termed the November 17th incident blurred together in my memory. I remember the medical tent, the psych evaluations, the increasingly frustrated officers demanding I retract my hallucinations. I remember being separated from Jake, catching only a glimpse of him being escorted to a transport helicopter, his eyes meeting mine briefly before they took him away. Most of all, I remember the silence that fell over Camp Victory. Not just quiet, silence. The kind that swallows sound, that makes you doubt your own voice when you speak. For 3 days after the incident, the entire base operated under that smothering blanket of silence, as if something vast was holding its breath, waiting. Then, as suddenly as it began, it lifted. The generators seemed louder again, voices carried across the compound, radios crackled with normal traffic. Life at Camp Victory resumed its wartime rhythm, and soldiers stopped talking about the night. The ground shook and red mist rose from the sand. But things had changed. The northwest perimeter, our old post, was quietly decommissioned. A new fence erected 50 meters inside the old one. That section of desert was declared off-limits due to unexploded ordnance. Guards were doubled at night. And no one, absolutely no one, talked about red eyes watching from the darkness. What do you think happened that night, Mr. Carter? The producer asks, pulling me back to the present. After 15 years of reflection, what's your theory? I consider my words carefully. I've learned that too much truth sounds like madness. I think we built a military base on something ancient, I say finally. Something that was contained, guarded, and I think we accidentally broke that containment. The Watcher, the entity with red eyes, You believe it was some kind of guardian? That's what Faisal tried to tell us. We thought it was hunting us, but it was warning us, marking us. I touched my chest where the red circle once burned. When we banished it during the blood moon, we removed the only thing keeping the larger presence in check. And what was this larger presence? I shake my head. I don't know its name. I don't think human languages have words for it. But it was vast, ancient, and it had been watching us from beneath the sand since long before we came to Iraq. The producer's expression remains neutral, professional. Several soldiers reported hearing whispers after the entity was supposedly banished. Did you experience this? Yes. First Faisal's voice, warning us. Then something else, something older. The memory makes my skin crawl even now. It knew my name. It said it could see me. And after the evacuation, the reports mention a complete withdrawal from that section of the base. By then, I was already being shipped out, strapped to a gurney, sedated. My mouth twists in a bitter smile. Dangerous to yourself and others. That's what they wrote. Shared psychotic disorder, mass hysteria. Convenient diagnoses for inconvenient witnesses. After my discharge, I spent years researching what happened at Camp Victory. I found scattered references to similar phenomena at other military bases in Iraq. Whispers in the sand, figures that vanished when approached. Unexplained markings appearing overnight. All quietly buried in classified incident reports, all dismissed as stress reactions or environmental misperceptions. But I also found older accounts, British soldiers during the colonial period, Ottoman records, even fragments of Babylonian texts, all describing watchers with burning eyes who appeared at boundaries, at crossroads, at places where worlds meet. Guardians at the threshold. One last question, Mr. Carter, the producer says, checking her notes. Camp Victory was officially transferred to Iraqi control in 2011. By then, the northwest sector had been completely abandoned, according to satellite imagery. Do you know what's there now? Nothing, I reply. That area remains empty. No construction, no agriculture, not even foot traffic according to locals. Just empty desert. What I don't tell her is that I've seen the satellite photos, tracked the changes over years, how the empty section has grown, the perimeter of abandonment expanding outward in a perfect circle, how the sand there appears redder than the surrounding desert, even from space. How sometimes, if you look at the thermal imaging captured at night, you can make out patterns in the temperature variations, circles within circles, forming shapes like the ones I used to draw in my journal, the ones I still draw sometimes when the dreams come back. Thank you for your time, Mr. Carter, the producer says, switching off her recorder. Your testimony will be valuable for our documentary. Will anyone believe it? I ask. She gives me a measured look. The truth has a way of emerging, even from the sand. After she leaves, I stand at my living room window, watching darkness gather in the corners of my suburban yard. In the glass reflection, I catch a glimpse of movement behind me, a shadow darker than it should be, with 2 pinpoints of red light where eyes might be. I don't turn around. I've learned that some watchers are protectors, not predators. It's still out there, isn't it? I whisper to the reflection. What watches from beneath? The shadow doesn't answer, but I feel the familiar weight of being observed, the prickle at the back of my neck that's never fully disappeared since Iraq. Some nights I wonder if it followed me home, or if it was always here too, sleeping beneath different sand. Some nights I wonder if what happened at Camp Victory was just the beginning of something larger, a first tremor before a greater awakening. But most nights, I'm simply grateful for the red-eyed watcher that stands guard in my shadows, keeping the barrier intact between my world and what lies beneath. Because some boundaries should never be crossed, some ancient things should remain buried, and some watchers are all that stand between us and the darkness that has always been watching. Subscribe for more paranormal war stories.